Yeah, good afternoon, and thank you very much to our presenters for their input today. We've had several questions come in, and perhaps I can start with the first question from Gary Mason-Ling from the Metropolitan Police, which came in during your Ruth's presentation. And that's really, the term AI has become a fashionable term, but do we actually have true AI at the moment, or is it just clever programming? Can I perhaps start with you on that one, Rednan?
So it's not just clever programming. Is it true AI? Is a subjective question, in my opinion. So yes, algorithmically, it's mathematical in terms of predictive AI. So it's a lot of mathematical algorithms deciding what the likely outcome is. Generative AI is slightly different. In terms of large language models, essentially it's essentially a selection of a large amount of trained data, randomly trained into the model, and then its ability to do things like simply completing sentences and suggesting the next word in a sentence. So it's clever in that sense. But we are moving and gradually moving towards that holy grail where we have what people would call, true AI, which is where AI starts to reason like a human being and can start to tackle tasks like that. But I think, in terms of tools, AI has been a tool for a long time that's been very effective. But also, I think now generative AI is effective when applied to the right use case, as I said. And I think really it's more a question of look at the outcome you can achieve, how you can, what you can actually do with it, so much as whether it's true AI or not. But we are headed in that direction, and there's an immense amount of research going on in that area.
Okay, I mean, another interesting question that's come in is from Andrew Elliott from Northumberland Police, who is involved with training of new officers. Now, one of the things when we were putting these webinars together, which became apparent, is that there is a lot of discussion going on at quite a strategic level and with those within the tech environment. But it doesn't appear to be filtering down through various channels within policing in particular. And what he says is that most of the police officers that he teaches are aged between 20 to 25. They're heavily using ChatGPT for portfolios, work-based assessments, and police work, such as statements and crime investigation advice. But he's finding that the restrictions on this are nearly impossible to prevent due to personal device usage, and forces being very slow in sending out advice. Ruth, is this, I think you're with us now, although I see your mic is that something perhaps you could pick up on in the first instance? I'll tell you that, David, I'll come to you in that case while Ruth sorts out a microphone.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, I think my video is working. Yeah, it's a really great question, and I think we've seen a lot of media discussion around the use of things like ChatGPT in education, for example, and the need for guidance in that context. And I think, I guess the good news is that the police are not alone in having this issue within the workplace, and I'm sure it's happening across pretty much every sector. But obviously the consequences here are pretty significant. And I think, I know it's not in the list of questions, but I think there are broader questions around criminal justice and all those sorts of things. We've seen AI use cases, for example, of being able to generate text from crime scene notes, for example. And so lots of shortcuts like that, where I think there are really significant implications of inaccuracies or biases being perpetuated within the data. So yeah, I mean, all I can do is empathize with Andrew, because I can only imagine how widespread this will be and will be moving forward. And it is genuinely a concern. But I can also understand how easy it would be to do and think you could either get away with it or it's just a really useful shortcut. So yeah, no sort of clear answer, but yeah, empathy for sure.
So David, you're sorry, yeah, if I can come in, it's something, yeah, we do see in other areas. It's not an unusual issue. I think there are a couple of discussion items here. One is policy-based. You can't solve all problems with technology, and certainly making clear policy discussions. But we found that many of our customers have also had to have an alternative. It can't be just stop using ChatGPT, but to start introducing safe tooling of the type I've described. So small models that are focused on the domains that you've described, trained in a specific way that could be run within the guardrails of the police force, in on-premise or in safe zones, so that actually the information that you're putting up there isn't shared publicly, but also that the research is accurate, or at least has a chance to be accurate, and is auditable and is trackable. Because I think all of those things, how did you come to the decision you came by, maybe ensuring the human in the loop with that process is going to be critical. These are things that are starting to happen in industry, and I think maybe it's easy to say you can't do something, but you need to replace it with something else, and there are strategies for doing that.
Okay, thank you. Ruth, are you do you have your microphone now?
Yeah, hopefully you can hear me okay.
That's good. Yeah, is anything
Okay.
you'd like to add to that?
I would just echo Brendan's point actually around keeping the human in the loop. I think that's still really important, and there has been really good use cases within law firms, for example, who will use various AI tools now, whereby actually instead of just telling you something or giving you an answer, it will actually tell you how it has reached that answer, which is actually really quite effective and gives that reassurance to end users as well. But certainly for now, I think while it's useful, this will have the human eye is super important.
Okay, thank you very much. While you're there, Ruth, one other question that came in during your presentation is, what is noise? Which came in from Anthony Donovan at Nottinghamshire Police.
I think what that actually refers to.
Does anybody else want to jump in there? Brendan?
No, I read that and was slightly bemused as well. Perhaps
Okay.
you could have an
Anthony,
update on that
if you're
question.
still online, give us a bit more detail and we'll come back to
Yeah,
that.
I will do. Let me go and check.
Fine. Claire Harvey from Internet Intelligence and Investigations Capability. What are the speaker's views on guidance and rules about using data sets ethically to train LLM, etc., and how do we ensure the public, and she's thinking of current issues with Fold from Ashton and Mumsnet Forum. So perhaps can I come to you, Brendan, first on that one?
Yeah, so this is something we do have a strong opinion on. So the open source models we've trained have been very carefully filtered for things like hate and profanity, privacy, copyright, a lot of deduplication. In fact, of the trained data, we've reduced much of the data by 3/4, so that actually the data we hold within those models, we are safe to indemnify. Believe me, it's hard to get anything through legal in IBM because we're actually sure of the data that's in there. That's one side of it. So the data contained in the model, and we're seeing other vendors start to move to that position as well. But it's also important that when you train the model on a domain, and whatever size model it is, that the quality of data you're applying to train that model has been tested, because there's no point having that base foundation that's good and then you train it on a specific domain with spurious data. There's only one outcome for that. So essentially we're seeing a lot of work around making sure that the data you train the model on is of a quality. And I think the last thing to say is using the right experience and techniques to ensure that you reduce the possibilities of things like hallucination, which can be an issue, that you're checking the feedback, you're actually producing outcomes of how the data is derived is really important. And just one other thing I'd like to add is that whole process needs to be governed. You need to have observability both of how that generative AI is running and how it's answering the questions, be it accuracy, be it readability, certainly something we're doing with people like DEFRA, but also that you're tracking that it is still not becoming biased, that it's still, it's still along the ethical guidelines with which you developed it. So I think there's a lot in this space that is out there, and gradually the market is moving towards, and indeed we believe we're driving. I wouldn't mention it if I didn't think we were strong there.
David, is there anything you want to add on that?
Yeah, I'm probably less optimistic and bullish than Brendan is, but obviously I'm not coming on from a particular corporate perspective. But I mean, I do think all the evidence so far for particularly, for both large and small LLMs in particular, is that there's not anywhere near enough transparency around the training data. We've seen lots of evidence that big companies are, essentially viewing that anything that is available on the internet is fair game in terms of copyrighted material, issues with, there's all sorts of IP cases in the courts at the moment, because a lot of the strategy behind these models is essentially we'll train them up on this data and get to the point where we're so successful and big that it's kind of fait accompli and we can't do anything about it. So I think there are some massive issues out there. I think the bias question or bias issue that's been mentioned by everyone is also a huge problem. I mean, you can't remove bias, you can try and mitigate it as much as possible. But I think the big concern in the law enforcement context is that if you roll these models out and, as Brendan said, don't have an understanding of what data has been trained on, or how models arrived at the advice, decision, the information they provide you, that it becomes quite hard to have that kind of transparency and accountability when we're talking about criminal justice issues. So I think there are some huge issues out there. There's some really fast moving legal developments in this space in terms of what different models can and can't be trained on, and we're seeing some licensing deals happening again with some of the bigger models where they're saying to whatever media organization, the Financial Times, for example, okay, can we use the Financial Times data set and make that legitimate? So it's kind of a tacit admission that up until now, they've been trading on data that they can scrape and steal from the internet. So that's good. It's good. It's progress. But I do think the ethical question is a really huge one in this area.
Brendan, I saw you shaking your head a couple of times there. Did you want to come back on anything?
No. So I agree with just about everything you said. I think, however, the reason for my optimism is because I know the effort we've taken around the data provenance within our models, and is particularly well received, especially in highly regulated industries and areas which I consider. I think there's a difference between large consumer-based models, and I would call ChatGPT that, and some of the bigger models. And the movement towards smaller, more targeted models that I described in my presentation that are task-based, domain-specific, and will develop further to actually deliver an outcome that's pertinent to the police, for example, rather than just be a general pot to answer questions of everything of who's the next president to perhaps helping someone with their casework or whatever it might be.
Thanks. If we come back to you, Ruth, we've got a bit more clarification. And the question is, what is noise in the context of image creation?
Apologies. I was up at 4 a.m. this morning to fly to London, so my brain is a little bit frazzled, to be honest. In terms of stable diffusion, and a lot of these AI image generators, they work from text prompts. And essentially, noise is a form of text prompt. There's 3 different text prompts that stable diffusion does use. And that's a kind of generic term to explain an autoencoder that stable diffusion does use. So essentially, it's text generation through an encoder.
Great. Thank you for that clarification. Jen Granham from Avon and Somerset has come back on something we've touched on already, that this is around sort of forces not acting fast enough to give out advice regarding the use of AI. So what advice should we be giving? For example, I mean, obviously the NPCC have recently appointed their first national lead for AI, Alex Murray, who in fact will be presenting next week. But again, perhaps I can start with you, Brendan, on that one. What sort of advice should we be giving to forces?
Well, I can only relate to the organisations I belong to. Look, this is a human problem, not a technology problem, and I think there's an element to which, it's not just about saying you can't do things. As I said earlier, I think it's about explaining and training and helping people understand what the risks are, what the implications are. Even explaining the level of reliability of using some tools. Without checking the answers, why they need to be the human in the loop. But also, I think it's not enough to just do that. Like any organization or individual that's found a way of making their job easier, it's really hard to switch that off unless you provide them a structured way in which they can do that safely within the the organization. And critically, I think this is probably where the investment going forward will go to not only stop that shadow exercise working, but perhaps to enhance what the capability that they're using to make it more effective and deliver better outcomes quicker, and perhaps releasing some of the workload, especially the administrative workload, in a safe way, in a managed way that really the forces have, governance and management over, which I think is critical. So I just don't want to get away from the fact that this is not a technological solution. This is about, empathy with the human approach and the human, the statement of humankind, a need to make their life easier and get through the day quicker, and providing, perhaps decent approaches to counteract that, as well as guidance and education.
Thanks. David, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, no, I think Brendan is right. It's very difficult to tell people not to do something that makes their job easier. I think the other thing to caveat, I suppose, is that there's been a really big move towards OSINT in general over the last 10 or 15 years, and a recognition of the value of open source research. And all of the big search engines are integrating AI and AI chatbots, including within their kind of search functionality. So I think at the moment we kind of can sort of delineate between generative AI and regular search and OSINT, but that line is going to get a lot more blurred. And obviously there are already processes and policies in place for OSINT. So I think Brendan's right that the challenge is, when it comes to that investment and resources in general, we know that it's a really challenging environment. So obviously it'd be preferable to say, well, don't just use these general models that are relatively unreliable, but let's develop our own in-house system, or models that can be trained on our own data. And I think that's obviously the preferred outcome, because you deliver the efficiencies that people are searching for, but in a safer way. I think definitely concerns that some off-the-shelf models might be used that still have some of those ethical and reliability issues, but are seen as a kind of cheaper or quicker option to get to the end. But yeah, I think the genie's kind of out of the bottle now, and it's going to be hard to sort of say it's just, it's not, you can't use. And I think to the question from Jennifer, but other questions around personal devices versus police devices, it realistically is going to happen. So there has to be a way of kind of addressing that need in a different way.
Okay, Ruth, did you want to say anything?
I think, to be honest, it's been well covered, Kevin. Thank you.
An interesting one from Harjinder Singh from West Yorkshire Police. How far are the UK police from needing to be AI literate and maybe even experts on cyber investigations? A question which might be controversial, which I'll pose to you all here now, is: do we need to train up police officers to become experts, or do we buy in that expertise, allowing officers to get on with their investigation jobs? Start with you, David, on that one, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly in the counter-terrorism space. There's been, as Ruth mentioned, a lot of conferences I've been to in the last year, a lot of really live questions around that. And I think we're not too far away from seeing, well, we're already seeing court cases in different contexts where people are, trying to argue that images or videos are actually, AI generated and therefore shouldn't be used as evidence against them. And so, there's going to be some really blurred lines. And I know there's obviously a lot of work being done to detect generative AI images, audio, video, and that's a work in progress. It's definitely a challenge and something that social media companies are also going to have to help with. But it is very difficult if you're doing cyber investigations, you're doing cyber forensics, digital forensics. All of us have been experimenting with this technology over the last 18 months, and criminals, I'm sure, are no different in that respect. So they are going to be cropping up in investigations, and I think it is something that has to be at least an awareness of. If you're, get your hands on a device and find imagery, video, audio, that there has to be at least a consideration that it might not be authentic. And all of that will obviously go further down the criminal justice chain. So I do think, as I said at the end of my presentation, being on top of this as soon as possible is definitely the way to go, particularly considering the user stats and the investment that Brendan mentioned in his presentation.
Okay, Brendan, anything you'd like to add to that?
I think as let's say a civilian here, my concern is, does more crime become lucrative online using this technology, and therefore require a shift in the posture to be able to deal with it. And I guess the analogy for me having kids is really the cyberbullying and that, which I think the UK police have really started to address quite well. And certainly the messages that I get through our school, etc., and the training that's given out is great. My concern is, all the things that Ruth mentioned and David mentioned are areas where I think there's money to be made and crime to be had. And my concern is if it's more lucrative to do that than it is to do that physically on the streets, certainly more intelligent criminals are surely going to take advantage of that. And that worries me a little bit, because, if it outpaces our ability to deal with it, then that's a problem. So I guess my statement is really a question of, do you think we should be dealing with this? Because there's potentially a shift here.
Right, thank you, Ruth.
To answer the question specifically, I would say yes, absolutely. The police need to be well aware of AI. If you even rewind back, maybe 10, 15 years, whenever, we really started to take account of computer crime, I felt at that time the police were trying to play catch up with what computer or cyber crime was. I think it would be an absolute mistake for police, certainly within cyber crime units, for example, not to be well versed on AI at this stage and not to leave it to the experts, because the criminals have been taking advantage of it already. And we're seeing that in various types of crime. So I think to buy in expertise, it may be a short-term benefit, but I do think the police need to be very, very hands-on with AI and actually embrace it, certainly going forward from an investigative capacity, for sure.
Fine, thanks. As we go into our last 5 minutes, perhaps if I can just put one final question to you all. This comes in from Lisa McCarthy from the Crown Prosecution Service and deals with the issue of disclosure, because obviously the police and prosecution obviously have a duty of disclosure. But what is the response likely to be for requests for the provision of disclosure of various data sets and processes used by AI software providers? So probably, Brendan, you're the best person to start with on that one.
That's a fantastic question, isn't it? I think in the production of, whether it be a criminal case or any type of interaction using AI and data that potentially is used to change the perspective on a case or a situation, that not only should we be transparent about the data used, but transparent about the way that it's being retrieved. We should be able to explain the tooling we've used and be transparent about that. And just like we do in summarization, we should show the original alongside the summarization to show how are we gone about summarizing it, what the methods were. Because I think really the thing that worries me about generative AI is not is it able to do things, but do we delegate so much responsibility and never check it? So if you say, the layman's version is, if I ask it to summarize a document for my boss and I don't check it and then I send it to my boss, is it providing the summary I'd like my boss to have? If I'm being convicted based on a document summarist or original investigation online, I'd like to be able to have the full information disclosed, the methods that we use to obtain that information, how it was treated, all of those sorts of things I'd certainly like to know. But I'm not an expert in disclosure, so I'm sure my colleagues David and Ruth will have more information on this.
David?
Yeah, certainly not an expert, and I think it's obviously a new problem, but I guess hopefully some lessons learned. I think certainly to the second part of the question in terms of, I think it's still relatively uncertain what information is being stored and how by different generative AI companies. And so I think in the case of social media companies, over time, police, law enforcement, criminal justice practitioners across the world have got used to knowing, well, this is what Facebook would be storing on a particular user. This is what's achievable. This is the process that we need to follow. And I think at the moment, in terms of AI software providers, I don't know how familiar anyone is with that. And that kind of thing kind of generally develops with time. Police forces learn what they can and can't access and what isn't stored. So, if you think about something like ChatGPT, you're asking very specific questions in a way that, if that information is retrievable, would be incredibly useful from a criminal justice perspective. But yeah, obviously there are different safeguards in place, different legal frameworks depending on hosting and all those sorts of things. So I think it's an emerging space would be my take. But yeah, maybe Ruth will know more.
Thank you, Ruth.
I think it's a really tricky area for the criminal justice sector, because if we think about how these LLMs are trained upon thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of data sets, how transparent will that be whenever something does go to court? And of course, there's discussion around ethics and how these data sets have been trained, and there's also elements of bias as well. So I can see why in a court setting that this would create a lot of anxiety, because we simply don't know every single data set that has been used to train these models. So it's highly problematic, to be honest. So it's an excellent question. And it's one I think we're going to struggle to get to the bottom of, because ethically it is a challenging area for sure.
Fine. Well, obviously we're all on an extremely steep and fast running curve in respect of all this. Interesting that you should follow on the ethical approach to this, because obviously that's the subject of next week's, which will be picked up by Alex Murray. So thank you for that introduction to next week's webinar, Ruth. Can I express my thanks to all three of you for your participation today, and to everybody that's put the questions in. And obviously it is on demand for people that have registered to go in and view this again if they need to. So thank you once again, and I'll finish the session, and more or less right on time. Thank you very much.